Wisconsin is going back to work.
I'm Steve Walders.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
This is Rewind, WisconsinEye's summary of this week in the Capitol. The most drama this week came in the state Senate, which debated a bill that would limit absentee voting 7 months before the November elections. Rather than J.R. and I summarizing it, let's listen to Democratic Lena Taylor saying why it's a bad idea, hearkening back to the days of Jim Crow, and Senator Fitzgerald backing it. Let's listen.
I feel like I'm in 1906, fighting the fights that people who came long before me had to fight. I feel like I'm fighting the fights to just make sure that people have access to the ability to vote. And I would argue that it screams of backward thinking mentality all the way back to Jim Crow, and you should be shamed.
Where I have constituents approach me and they say, Fitz, what's going on? How come every time I turn on the TV, I see that there's a long line of people in Milwaukee County voting? I can't vote. I can't go down to the town of Kleiman right now because there's nobody there. It just presents the image, whether you buy into it or not, that it's not fair. People expect the polls to open at a specific time and close at a specific time, and they expect that to be statewide.
JR, I want to ask you whether the Assembly is going to accept that those limits on absentee balloting, but let's summarize it again. Prohibit absentee ballot a weekend and holidays, and allow no local clerk to permit absentee voting more than 45 hours per week. Pretty big change. Is the Assembly going to take it?
Well, the Assembly likes the principle, if you will, but there's a provision added to that bill in the Senate that would basically, I think, put about $200,000 to help pay for the cost of early voting, particularly in smaller communities. That's still a question. The Assembly, will they accept that? They have the option of approving the Senate bill but taking that out and then kicking it back. And they'll be up to the Senate to say whether that's good enough for them to be done with it and go forward.
The Assembly has stacked a lot of election law changes at the door of the Senate, right? But this is the only one that is this the biggest Senate focus?
Well, remember the Assembly actually passed its own bill on early voting. Senator of the Senate and then Senator LaSalle voted against it in committee. So that kind of held that one up. So
Good
that
point.
one got pushed aside. This is the compromise that worked in the Senate. But like a lot of things this session, well, the compromise for the Senate worked for the Assembly Republicans because it's a much different dynamic in those two caucuses.
Right. And the Senate also put on the governor's desk a bill that says election observers can be within 3 feet of poll workers. Now, Wisconsin, I went to the props department, JR. This table is exactly 3 feet wide. That's pretty close, man. I didn't know when they debated it how close it was, but as much I respect you a great deal, but man, that's really close.
Well, it's 3 to 8 feet, and I will guess that in some places that are not happy about the change, it'll be closer to the 8-foot limit, if you will. But this is, again, is kind of a recurring Republican argument when it comes to election laws. We need a statewide standard. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats answer, okay, that's great, but your standard really is only going to apply to Milwaukee and downtown Madison around the student wards, because they don't really see election observers in great numbers hanging out in rural Wisconsin, Cuba City, for example. They're all north side of Milwaukee. And that's the issue for Democrats is this isn't about, standards, it's about like watching our voters, if you will, go to the polls.
But the governor will take this 3-foot bill?
Sounds like it, yes.
Okay, I'll lay the prop aside since I damaged it before. JR, next week is critical because Speaker Voss says he doesn't want the Assembly to meet after next week. So summarize the biggest sticking points next week between the Assembly and the Senate.
Right now, Tuesday's calendar for the Assembly looks fairly non-controversial. There are a couple smaller things that have flared up, like limiting liability for shooting ranges, for example. There's a sales tax exemption for certain ag stuff. That there'll be a couple no votes on that. But for the most part, it's a pretty quiet calendar. The big thing is Thursday. You'll see these election bills pop back. Some of them, what will the Assembly do with those? They also have to approve the governor's, property and income tax plan. So there's that stuff, but there's still a lot of pent-up stuff out there that hasn't passed. For example, school accountability.
School accountability.
So
I'm glad you went there.
Now the path forward seems to be the Education Committee in the Assembly hasn't voted on the new version, or the newest new version of that bill, because it's been redone a couple of times. Now they're talking about bypassing the committee, going to the floor, and doing the bill there. it's not going to pass in the end because it won't get through both houses. The Senate and the Assembly cannot get on the same page when it comes to that bill, but it's clear that's a priority for Robin Vos and GP leadership in the Assembly to do their real, accountability measure versus the bare bones one the Senate did.
Right, and also the Assembly next week is going to sign off on the governor's $500 million tax cut. It was tweaked by the Senate, but there's going to be a victory lap on that.
Absolutely.
JR, we missed. There was no rewind last week, so we didn't get a chance to talk about Bill Kramer. Do you think he was removed as majority leader because of the claims of sexual harassment? The Assembly meets next Tuesday, Thursday. Will he be back?
Interestingly enough, nobody's heard from him. Now, I mean, this is part of being in therapy. Now, we don't know what he's being treated for or where he's at.
Yep.
Those kinds of things. But basically what they've told us is he's really gone away. He's cut off contact. He is in treatment and can't be reached. So there's no indication he'll be on the floor. I don't know if they want the circus, if you will, of him walking back on the floor, freshly deposed, even if he were eligible to come back.
No longer in the front row. He'll be back wherever he is. Go ahead. Excuse me.
So there's that whole thing. And then, will he file the run for election? I mean, we're a very forgiving culture in this country, if you will. If you have your mea culpa, say, I'm sorry, all that kind of stuff. But Republican primary voters, when it comes to values issues, sometimes aren't so forgiving. If he does run, there will be a number of Republicans who line up to run against him. He'll be very vulnerable. It's a very conservative district. He will not like this stuff. So there's a thought that he may serve out the rest of this term because they're done after Thursday, won't come back.
Only 2 more session days.
But to run for election, very tough. I mean, he would face a very difficult primary fight if he did.
And the deadline that he has to, that he faces a deadline of May 24 to file a statement of non-candidacy. It's very, very interesting. JR, oral chemotherapy bill. I had never seen this procedural motion. Senator Fitzgerald filed a motion. Senate Org Committee would hold a public hearing to block a pulling motion in the Senate. What's a backstory on that?
So 2 things. One, yes, he called a public hearing, then canceled it immediately after they got off the floor. What it does, though, is you can't do a pulling motion. If you can do a polling motion on a bill, you get a roll call on the bill.
Yes.
That then ends up in literature come November or October, November.
Yeah.
So there's that dynamic. The second one is this bill has bipartisan support, but it does not have the full caucus support in the Senate. Now, here's the issue with that. One, Jeff Fitzgerald, former Speaker, Scott's brother, is lobbying against the bill. There are those who will make hay that, hey, this is about doing a favor for his brother. The bigger picture, though, if you pull back and look at the insider view, is that it's leadership 101. You do not want to go to the floor with a bill you can't get through with the support of your own caucus. If you're relying on the minority to provide you votes to pass a bill, that is A, threat to your leadership down the line because it shakes your confidence in the caucus, and B, that's one way for you to lose the majority in general if the minority drive the agenda. That's a lesson from Scott Jensen from years ago, back in the 90s when Democrats lost the Assembly. So there's that dynamic. And 2, even if they pass the bill, there's no guarantee to go through the Assembly because Robin Vos has told me that he doesn't like the mandate, and that's the word they're using in this bill, the mandate. Because if
insurance companies must cover oral chemotherapy bills.
So if you must cover, that means people like you and I who don't have cancer would have our premiums go up to pay for it. Now, how much?
Right.
Those are all policy debates for other people, but that's where they're using mandate. We don't like the mandate, especially with Obamacare. What it's doing in the insurance industry, they don't like the mandate being placed on companies.
I understand. So next week will be a huge day, or huge week of action. Okay, time for Wisconsin WisPolitics stock picks. Rising.
Voter ID, interesting, the governor made the call for a special session, or said he would, if the courts weigh in and nix the requirement ahead of November elections. Now here's what's interesting about that. One, the timing. So the Supreme Court usually took the oral arguments 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
They come back in May, maybe June with the decision. Lynn Edelman, the federal judge, also has a challenge before him.
Yes.
He's not going to rule until after the state Supreme Court is done.
Right.
Most likely, he's not required to, but that's kind of how these things work. So let's say he issues a ruling, June 30th. So now you're talking about both houses coming back mid-July with a primary mid-August.
Wow.
So 1, local clerks will scream bloody murder. 2, even if you do it, The opponents will go to court again
Yes.
and ask for another injunction. And 3, there's a political dynamic for Governor Walker. There are people who's like, this is kind of bravado, to say, hey, we'll do this right before my reelection. But it is a very popular issue with people. So it jazzes up the base for Governor Walker. And there's really no downside, because if you're the average voter, you think it's a good idea. It's only the core Democrats who are screaming about this one right now.
Thank you. And mixed?
Mary Burke. So now she's had a rough go of it with like the resume and whether she's being truthful and honest and all these kinds of things. That, though, isn't really breaking through with the average voter when I talk to operatives. What it is, though, is setting a foundation for the attack later on about her come October, and it helps Republicans create this like character issue. Democrats have an opening, they think, with Governor Walker about ethics, right? The John Doe emails, we can kind of go after him about that. If you're a Republican and can raise a character issue on Mary Burke, who was supposed to be kind of like this person who wasn't in politics, was above it all, could kind of come in and run without that baggage, you create the character issue, you've muddied the water on ethics with Governor Walker.
Okay. That's mixed.
The flip side, though, is that Mary Burke has a headline now, the race is tied. Now, Rasmussen reports, not the best polling outfit in the country. People kind of have some mistrust about it. Automated phone calls, that kind of stuff, not great. But it's the headline that matters for her. We are tied. I'm 6 months out from this election, and I am neck and neck with Scott Walker. That's a great fundraising pitch.
And falling.
Tim Carpenter, if you followed the debate
Spent a lot of time on the floor.
Yeah, followed the debate on Tuesday. Now, how he said it is up for debate, what he was trying to get at. But when he went after Mary Lozic saying she hates Milwaukee, hates clerks, hates blacks and Latinos, he says coming out to vote for Democrats. But that wasn't how Republicans interpreted it. Now, regardless of what he meant to say or how he said it, there's a decorum, if you will, that's expected on the floor. Even some of his colleagues in the Democratic caucus are like, that was one step too far. We don't do that kind of stuff in the Senate.
I understand. We're out of time. I'm Steve Walders.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
And that's Rewind for March 14th. Thank you.